January 17, 1945. Somewhere in the frozen Ardennes forest, beneath a stone-vaulted ceiling that once belonged to a Belgian monastery, the air inside the German command post hung thick with cigar smoke and the smell of schnapps. Outside, the wind carved through bare oak trees, carrying with it the distant percussion of artillery, a sound so constant it had become part of the landscape itself, like the breathing of some massive, invisible beast. Inside, 11 Wehrmacht officers stood around a map table, their faces half shadowed by kerosene lamplight, their winter uniforms still bearing the stains of the offensive that was supposed to have ended this war. Generalmajor Ernst Koch raised his glass. The crystal caught the amber light, fragmenting it across his weathered face. He was 43 years old, but looked 60. The Eastern Front had done that to him. Stalingrad, Kursk, the long, terrible retreat across the Ukrainian steppe. But now, here in the West, there was still a chance. There had to be. His voice, when he spoke, carried the practiced authority of a man who had spent 2 decades commanding other men to die. "Gentlemen," he said, "to victory by dawn." The words hung in the cold air like a prayer. 11 glasses clinked, 11 throats swallowed, and somewhere beyond the monastery walls, in the darkness that precedes the deepest part of night, the first American artillery shells were already being loaded into howitzer breaches 6 kilometers away. Koch did not yet know he had 4 hours and 37 minutes left to believe in German victory in the West. None of them did. Not Oberst Dietrich, who had commanded panzer battalions across half of Europe. Not Major Steiner, who had calculated their supply logistics down to the last liter of fuel. Not the young Hauptmann whose name would be lost to history, who stood at the back of the room and wondered, privately, if the schnapps they were drinking was worth more than the fuel their tanks no longer had. They were professional soldiers, these men. They had studied at the Kriegsakademie. They had learned the lessons of von Clausewitz and von Moltke. They understood combined arms warfare, operational mobility, the psychological impact of shock and speed. What they did not understand, what they could not have understood, standing there in that monastery with their maps and their calculations, was that they were about to collide with something entirely outside their doctrinal framework. Not superior German strategy overcome by superior Allied strategy. Not one general's brilliance against another's, but rather an entirely different conception of what war could be, powered by an industrial and logistical system so vast it had no historical precedent. They were officers of the Wehrmacht, an army that still moved much of its artillery with horses, that counted its remaining tanks in dozens when it once counted them in thousands. They were about to face the full concentrated weight of American industrial capitalism, translated into military force, and that translation would arrive not as an idea, but as steel and fire, and a rate of shell fire their own army had never remotely approached, even in its greatest days. The German offensive in the Ardennes, what the Americans would call the Battle of the Bulge, had begun on December 16th, 1944. It was Hitler's last great gamble in the West, a plan born of desperation and fed by delusion. The logic, if it could be called logic, went like this. Germany could not win a long war of attrition against the combined industrial might of America, Britain, and the Soviet Union. Therefore, Germany must not fight a long war of attrition. Therefore, Germany must split the Western Allies, drive to Antwerp, cut off the British and Canadian armies in the north, force a political settlement, then turn all forces east to deal with the Soviets. Therefore, and here was where military planning gave way to something closer to magical thinking, therefore surprise and willpower and the fighting quality of the German soldier would overcome the material superiority of the enemy. In the first days, it almost worked. Not because the strategic logic was sound, it wasn't, but because the Wehrmacht, even in late 1944, even bleeding from 1,000 wounds, could still concentrate force at a point and achieve tactical surprise. 3 German armies, 28 divisions, more than 400,000 men, had smashed into a lightly held sector of the American line. The weather was terrible. Thick fog, snow, the kind of weather that grounded Allied aircraft and gave the Germans the one thing they absolutely needed: freedom from aerial observation and attack. American units were overrun, surrounded, pushed back. Entire regiments ceased to exist as organized formations. The German spearheads drove west, chasing the ghost of 1940, when everything had been possible and France had fallen in 6 weeks, and Britain had seemed next, and the whole world had trembled. But 1944 was not 1940, and the American Army of 1944 was not the French Army of 1940, and most importantly, the German Army of 1944 was not the German Army of 1940. The Wehrmacht that invaded France had been a fully motorized, lavishly supplied, tactically innovative force at the absolute peak of its power. The Wehrmacht that attacked in the Ardennes was a hollowed-out remnant, scraping together vehicles from training depots, putting boys of 16 and men of 40 into uniform, running tanks on fuel reserves that would last days at best. The plan called for capturing American fuel depots to keep the advance going. The plan required seizing American supplies to feed German soldiers. The plan, in other words, required winning quickly, because the logistical basis for winning slowly no longer existed, and for a few days, as the American line buckled and bent, as German tanks drove toward the Meuse River. As Allied commanders scrambled to understand the scope and scale of the attack, it seemed like speed might be enough. This was what Koch and his fellow officers had been counting on. This was the victory they toasted in that monastery on the night of January 17. Not victory in the sense of winning the war. Even the most optimistic among them understood that ship had sailed. But victory in the immediate tactical sense. Victory meaning hold this position tonight, attack at first light, reach the next objective, keep the Americans off balance, exploit the gap, maintain momentum. Victory meaning survive another day with the illusion of control intact. They did not know that 60 kilometers away, Lieutenant Colonel Harvey Mitchell, commanding officer of the 284th Field Artillery Battalion, was standing in the snow looking at a map by flashlight and doing calculations of an entirely different kind. Mitchell was 31 years old. He was from Iowa. Before the war, he had taught high school mathematics. He was not a professional soldier, not in the European sense of the term. He had been commissioned in 1942, trained stateside, shipped to England, landed in Normandy 2 weeks after D-Day, and fought his way across France and Belgium with the dogged, pragmatic efficiency that characterized the American army at its best. He did not think in terms of glory or Clausewitz or the spirit of the offensive. He thought in terms of firing tables and ammunition, stocks and grid coordinates and the maximum sustained rate of fire his guns could maintain, and his guns could maintain a rate of fire that would have seemed impossible to Koch and his officers had they known. Each of Mitchell's 18 M114 155mm howitzers could fire 4 rounds per minute under ideal conditions, 3 rounds per minute sustainably. That was 54 rounds per minute for the battalion. Multiply that by the 6 battalions that would be supporting the counterattack, and you got over 300 heavy shells per minute landing on an area measured in square kilometers. Multiply that by 10 minutes, a standard preparatory barrage duration, and you got 3,000 shells. Multiply that by the fact that American logistics could sustain this rate of fire not for one attack but for weeks. Because the ammunition dumps were stocked with hundreds of thousands of rounds, because the trucks bringing more were already on the roads, because the factories back in Pennsylvania and Ohio were running 3 shifts and producing more every day. Multiply all that together, and you got something qualitatively different from anything the Wehrmacht had faced in the West before. This was not superior tactics. This was the mathematics of industrial abundance. The German army, even at its peak, had never been able to sustain this kind of fire for more than short periods before stocks ran low, and the horse-drawn supply columns had to catch up. The Soviet army could match it, but only by conscripting millions and suffering appalling losses and operating on shorter supply lines. The American army could do it almost casually, as a routine matter of procedure, because the productive capacity of the United States in 1944 was greater than that of all the Axis powers combined. America produced more steel than Germany and Japan together, more trucks, more aircraft, more of everything. And critically, this was the part the German generals consistently failed to internalize, America could deliver all that production to the battlefield, across an ocean, through a functioning logistics network that stretched from Detroit to the Ardennes without breaking. When German officers looked at American soldiers, they often saw what they expected to see: a conscript army, hastily trained, lacking the battlefield experience and professional military culture of the Wehrmacht. This was not entirely wrong. The average American rifleman in early 1945 had perhaps 9 months of total military experience, compared to years for his German counterpart. American small unit tactics were often crude compared to German standards. Man for man in a theoretical contest of infantry skill, the Wehrmacht still arguably held an edge. But this missed the point entirely. The American way of war did not rely on every infantryman being an expert soldier. It relied on overwhelming material support that made individual soldier quality less decisive. Why have your infantry conduct a risky close assault when you can simply flatten the objective with artillery first? Why risk casualties in street fighting when you can bring up a tank destroyer or call in an airstrike? The American system treated soldiers as valuable, not in some abstract moral sense, though that mattered too, but in a concrete practical sense. Trained soldiers took time and resources to produce. Therefore, save casualties where possible. Use firepower instead of manpower. Employ steel rather than flesh. The German military tradition was almost the opposite. It emphasized the decisive role of the fighting soldier, the importance of initiative and aggression, the willingness to accept casualties to achieve breakthrough. This had worked brilliantly when Germany had the industrial base to sustain it and weak opponents who could be defeated quickly. It was catastrophically unsuited to a long war of attrition against industrially superior enemies. By January 1945, Germany had suffered over 4 million military casualties. The experienced soldiers, the ones who had invaded Poland and France and Russia, were largely dead. The replacements were increasingly young, poorly trained, inadequately equipped, and yet they fought. This was the paradox that American soldiers found both baffling and terrifying. Even in January 1945, even as their country was being invaded from east and west, even as their cities were being bombed to rubble, German units often fought with ferocious determination. Partly, this was discipline. The Wehrmacht shot its own deserters and hanged its defeatists. Partly, it was propaganda. Years of being told that defeat meant annihilation. Partly, it was simply that once you are in the position of defending your own soil against invasion, surrender becomes psychologically harder, even when it is strategically rational. The officers in that monastery understood all this. They understood they were outnumbered, outgunned, running low on everything. They understood the Ardennes offensive had failed in its strategic objectives. Antwerp was still in Allied hands. The British and Canadian armies were still supplied. No political settlement was forthcoming. What they did not understand, what perhaps they could not allow themselves to understand, was that their operational methodology, the very grammar of how they thought about warfare, had become obsolete. At 03:48 hours on January 18, 1945, the IE 1st American artillery shell landed 700 meters from the monastery. The shell, a 150 mm high explosive round weighing 43 kilograms, covered the distance from gun to impact in approximately 19 seconds. It buried itself 1 meter into frozen earth before the fuse triggered the explosive charge, sending a wave of overpressure and fragmentation radiating outward at velocities exceeding 2,000 meters per second. The sound reached the monastery a moment later. Not a bang or boom, but something more visceral. A physical pressure against the eardrums, felt in the chest and gut. Koch dropped his glass. It shattered against the stone floor, schnapps pooling among the shards. He looked at Oberst Dietrich. Dietrich looked at the ceiling, as if he could see through stone and earth to the sky above. Major Steiner was already moving toward the map, but the map showed defensive positions and supply routes, not the fire. Missions of American artillery batteries whose locations he could only guess at. The young Hauptmann, whose name would be lost to history, moved toward the door, then stopped, then moved back. There was nowhere to go. The monastery had been chosen as a command post precisely because it was solid stone, resistant to anything but a direct hit. All they could do was wait. The second shell landed closer, then the third. Then they stopped counting because the shells were arriving in a continuous cascade, each explosion overlapping with the next, creating a sustained rolling thunder that seemed to come from everywhere at once. This was the TOT, time on target technique that American artillery had perfected. Multiple batteries firing at different times, calculated so that all shells arrived at the target simultaneously, giving no warning, no time to take cover. The Wehrmacht had nothing comparable. The Red Army had used massed artillery barrages at Stalingrad and Kursk, but those had been thundering buildups, waves of fire that ebbed and flowed. This was something else. Precision violence, mathematically distributed across the landscape. Outside the monastery, the world was being systematically dismantled. Trees were being stripped of branches by shell fragments. Earth was being thrown into the air and rearranged. The carefully prepared German defensive positions, trenches, foxholes, machine gun nests, were being obliterated faster than they could be abandoned. Men were dying, of course. That was what high-explosive shells did. But the shells were also doing something else, something the firing tables did not measure. They were destroying the possibility of coherent resistance. You could not coordinate a defense when communication lines were cut. You could not hold a position when the position no longer existed. You could not maintain unit cohesion when soldiers were scattered into whatever holes they could find, deafened and concussed, waiting for the bombardment to end. For the German soldiers experiencing this, the emotion was not fear in the simple sense. Fear was what you felt before combat, waiting for something to happen. This was past fear, into a kind of helpless rage and disbelief. Where were all these shells coming from? How could any army have this many shells to fire for this long at this intensity? The Wehrmacht's own artillery had been rationed to a few shells per gun per day for months now. Batteries saved their ammunition for critical moments, husbanded resources, fired carefully. And here were the Americans firing as if ammunition were infinite, as if the shells cost nothing, as if there were no tomorrow to save for, because tomorrow would bring just as many shells as today. This was the symbolic object that would haunt German accounts of fighting the Americans. The artillery shell itself, or more precisely, the incomprehensible quantity of artillery shells. Not a rifle or a tank or an airplane, though the Americans had plenty of those too, but the simple industrial product of steel casing, explosive filling, and fuse assembly, produced by the millions in factories that operated beyond the reach of German bombers, shipped across an ocean that Germany could no longer contest, stockpiled in dumps that contained more ammunition than the entire Wehrmacht had fired in some months, and expended with a casual abundance that seemed almost wasteful until you understood that it was the opposite of wasteful. It was the most efficient possible use of American industrial advantage. Private Hans Gruber, a rifleman in the 12th Volksgrenadier Division, would later write in a letter that somehow survived the war. We had been told that the Americans were cowards who relied on machinery because they could not fight like soldiers. We were told they would break when faced with determined resistance. We were told many things, but no one told us what it would be like to crouch in a hole while the earth itself seemed to be exploding for hours, until you could not think or hear or do anything but pray for it to stop. And then, when it stopped, before we could even climb out of our holes, there were the tanks. The tanks came at 06:27 hours, with first light. M4 Shermans of the 7th Armored Division, advancing in column along the road that ran past the monastery. They were not subtle. They did not need to be. The artillery had done its work. The German positions that were supposed to slow the American advance were craters and rubble. The anti-tank guns that were supposed to engage the Shermans were buried or destroyed or abandoned by crews who had fled during the bombardment. The Shermans rolled forward at 15 kilometers per hour, buttoned up, firing their 75mm main guns at anything that looked suspicious, their 30-caliber machine guns chattering periodically. Koch watched them from the monastery's second-floor window. He had moved up during the bombardment, reasoning that the upper floors were more likely to survive a near miss than the lower ones, though this was more superstition than engineering. From here, he could see perhaps a kilometer of road and forest. He counted 14 tanks. Behind them came the half-tracks carrying infantry. Behind those, more trucks than he could count, supply vehicles, fuel tankers, ambulances, engineer equipment. The American column seemed to stretch back to the horizon. It moved with the unhurried confidence of an army that knew it could replace whatever it lost, that operated on the assumption of material abundance rather than scarcity. This was the contrast that broke something in German military thinking. Not the loss, they had lost before, had retreated across half of Europe, but the nature of what they were losing to. There was no moment of battlefield glory here. No clash of wills between equally matched forces. No opportunity to demonstrate superior training or unit cohesion, or any of the qualities the Wehrmacht prided itself on. There was only the methodical application of overwhelming force, the reduction of combat to an industrial process. Identify target, calculate firing solution, deliver ordnance, advance, repeat. When the Shermans were 300 meters from the monastery, Koch gave the order to surrender. He did this by having a white sheet, torn from an actual bed, the same bed some Belgian monk had slept in before the war, hung from the window. The lead Sherman stopped. Its turret traversed toward the building. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, an American voice, amplified by some kind of loudspeaker, called out in accented German, "All personnel exit the building with hands raised. Leave weapons inside. You have 2 minutes to comply." 11 German officers walked out of the monastery into the cold morning air. Koch went first, because that was his responsibility. The others followed. They were not roughhoused or abused. American infantrymen, boys, really, most of them looked younger than 20, gestured them toward a half-track with machine gun motions that needed no translation. A captain approached, spoke briefly to Koch in English. Koch understood enough. They would be taken to a prisoner processing center, then to a rear area camp, then eventually to a POW facility in the United States. He would spend the rest of the war behind barbed wire in Texas, teaching mathematics to other prisoners, waiting for news that stopped coming after the Russians took Berlin. But that was later. In the moment, being loaded into an American half-track, Koch looked back at the monastery and thought about the toast they had drunk the night before. Victory by dawn. It seemed impossible that it had been less than 4 hours ago. It seemed like something from another lifetime, another world. The schnapps they had been drinking? Where had that even come from? Probably looted from some Belgian cellar in the first days of the offensive. The cigars had been hoarded from officers' rations that dated back to France. They had been living on the accumulated plunder and reserves of their earlier victories, spending down capital that could not be replaced. The Americans, by contrast, seemed to be living in a state of permanent resupply, an endless flow of material from some inexhaustible source. This was not precisely true. American logistics had limits, supply lines could be stretched, inventories could run low. But the American system had so much slack in it, so much redundancy, such deep reserves, that from a German perspective it might as well have been infinite. The United States was producing 50,000 aircraft per year. Germany was producing less than 40,000. The United States was building a major warship every day. Germany's shipyards were cratered by RAF bombs. The United States had gasoline rationing at home, but supplied its military with enough fuel to run millions of vehicles. Germany was synthesizing fuel from coal because its oil supplies had been cut off. The most striking aspect of American material superiority was not any single category, but the totality. More of everything, everywhere, all the time. More ammunition, more fuel, more food, more vehicles, more radios, more medical supplies, more everything. An American infantry division in early 1945 had roughly the same number of combat soldiers as a German division, perhaps 12 to 14,000 men. But the American division had 3 times as many vehicles, 5 times as much organic, artillery, 10 times the radio equipment, and logistical support capacity that exceeded the German equivalent by an order of magnitude. This translated into real battlefield advantages that had nothing to do with soldier quality or tactical doctrine. American wounded were evacuated quickly by ambulance and treated in field hospitals equipped with blood plasma and antibiotics. German wounded waited hours or days for horse-drawn carts and were treated in aid stations that often lacked basic supplies. American units could maneuver freely because they had the fuel to do so. German units carefully planned every movement. Because fuel reserves were measured in hours of operation, American commanders communicated by radio and received aerial reconnaissance updates. German commanders often relied on motorcycle couriers and guesswork. Private First Class John Wheeler of the 7th Armored Division, one of the infantrymen who accepted Koch's surrender, would later recall the moment in an oral history interview conducted in 1983. They came out of that building looking like ghosts, not scared exactly. More like shocked, like they couldn't believe what had just happened to them. Their uniforms were all dusty and torn up. Some of them were bleeding from ears, from the shelling, I guess. Our lieutenant asked if they had any wounded inside. One of them, an older guy with a lot of medals, said something in German. Our interpreter told us he said everyone inside was alive, but they had wounded at other positions who needed help. So we sent medics. That stuck with me, that even surrendering, that officer was thinking about his men somewhere else, made me wonder what we looked like to them. We must have seemed like we came from another planet or something. This was closer to the truth than Wheeler knew. To German soldiers in early 1945, the American army must indeed have seemed alien. Not because Americans were so different as individuals, but because they represented a totally different relationship between society and war. The Wehrmacht was the product of a militarized society that had oriented itself toward war for over a decade, that had conscripted its young men and mobilized its industries and subordinated civilian life to military necessity. And yet this mobilized society, this state organized for conquest, could not match the productive output of a democracy that had been at peace until 1941, and even in wartime maintained a civilian standard of living that exceeded wartime Germany's. This was the great ideological crisis embedded in the German military experience of fighting the Americans. Nazi ideology had predicted that democracies were weak, divided, incapable of sustaining will or effort. The racially mixed American army, with its Jewish soldiers and black soldiers and soldiers from every immigrant group imaginable, was supposed to be inherently inferior to the racially pure Wehrmacht. American consumer capitalism was supposed to have made Americans soft, materialistic, unwilling to sacrifice. American democracy was supposed to produce indecisive leadership, political paralysis, inability to concentrate resources. Every single one of these predictions had proven false. The American Army, for all its flaws and inefficiencies, was a functionally integrated military force that operated across multiple theaters simultaneously and sustained logistical operations on a global scale. American industry had not only equipped the U.S. military but provided substantial material support to Britain and the Soviet Union through Lend-Lease. American civilian living standards had actually risen during the war, even as the military ballooned to over 12 million personnel. American democracy had produced decisive leadership in Roosevelt and sustained strategic focus across 4 years of global warfare. The symbolic power of the artillery shell, that mundane industrial product expended in prodigious quantities, represented all of this. Each shell embodied American steel mills, American chemical plants, American rail networks, American port facilities, American merchant shipping, American logistics battalions, American doctrine that prioritized firepower over casualties. The shell was a physical manifestation of a system, and the system worked. For German officers trained in a tradition that emphasized willpower and unit spirit and tactical excellence, this was deeply disturbing. It suggested that all those qualities they had cultivated, all the professional military, education and combat experience and warrior ethos, could be simply overwhelmed by crude material superiority. It reduced warfare from an art to a matter of accounting. It made the individual soldier's courage or skill almost irrelevant. It turned battle into an industrial process, where victory went to whoever could deliver more tons of steel and explosive to the battlefield. This was not entirely true, of course. Individual courage and skill still mattered. Tactical excellence still provided advantages. The Americans made plenty of mistakes, suffered avoidable casualties, struggled with challenges like hedgerow fighting in Normandy, where German defensive expertise negated much of their material edge. But as a long-term strategic proposition, the mathematics were clear. Germany could not match American production. Therefore, Germany could not win a long war. Therefore, Germany had already lost, back in December 1941, when Hitler declared war on the United States, though it would take 3.5 more years and millions more deaths for that reality to work itself out. The aftermath of the Ardennes offensive confirmed this with brutal finality. The German attack had briefly disrupted Allied plans and inflicted significant casualties. About 19,000 Americans killed, another 60,000 wounded or missing. But these losses were replaced within weeks. The tanks and vehicles destroyed were replaced within days. The ammunition expended was barely noticed in the vast stockpiles. By the end of January, the bulge in the Allied line had been eliminated. By February, American and British forces were attacking into Germany itself. The Wehrmacht units that had fought in the Ardennes were shadows of their already depleted selves, exhausted, out of fuel, out of ammunition, out of time. Germany's final. Casualties in the Ardennes offensive were roughly equivalent to American losses, perhaps 20,000 dead, another 60,000 wounded or captured. But Germany could not replace these casualties. There were no fresh divisions in reserve. The training depots had been scraped clean. 16-year-olds and 50-year-olds were being put into uniform. The replacement soldiers arriving at the EP front had often received only a few weeks of training, just enough to know which end of a rifle the bullet came out of. The Eastern Front, where the Soviet winter offensive had begun on January 12th, was consuming divisions faster than they could be reconstituted even on paper. In the American prisoner of war camps, German soldiers encountered the final demonstration of American abundance. The camps themselves were built with materials that seemed incomprehensibly plentiful. Entire barracks constructed from timber and wire, heated in winter, supplied with running water. The food, by 1945 standards, was almost luxurious. Not luxurious. By American civilian standards, it was basic institutional fare, similar to what American soldiers ate. But by the standards of late-war Germany, it was astonishing. White bread, real coffee, meat multiple times per week, fresh vegetables. Prisoners gained weight. They received medical care that exceeded what many German civilians could access. The psychological impact of this cannot be overstated. These were men who had been told for years that Germany was fighting a desperate war of survival against enemies who wanted to annihilate them. They had been told that Germany was strong and its enemies were weak. They had been told that German soldiers were superior and sacrifice was necessary and victory was inevitable if they just held on. And then they were captured and found themselves in camps where the food was better than what they had eaten in years, where the guards were bored teenagers who treated them with casual indifference rather than hatred, where the entire atmosphere suggested that their captors had resources so abundant that housing and feeding thousands of prisoners was just another administrative task. Lieutenant Joseph Ritter, captured in January 1945 and sent to a POW camp in Arkansas, wrote in a diary entry from March, "Today, we were given ice cream. Ice cream! In the middle of this war, on another continent, in a camp that holds 10,000 prisoners, the Americans can somehow arrange for us to have ice cream. I do not know whether to laugh or weep. We were told Germany was the superior power, that our enemies were decadent and weak. But what kind of decadent weakness can produce ice cream for prisoners while simultaneously fighting wars on 3 continents? I begin to think we were lied to about many things." This was the final transformation, the recognition that the foundational assumptions had been wrong. Not just wrong about who would win. By 1945, many German soldiers suspected they would lose, but wrong about the basic nature of the antagonists. The Americans were not weak. Democracy was not inefficient. Capitalism was not decadent. Or rather, if these things were weaknesses, they were not weaknesses that mattered in the context of industrial warfare. The American system, for all its inefficiencies and inequalities and contradictions, could produce war material in quantities that defied comprehension. And that meant Germany, for all its military traditions and tactical excellence and ideological fervor, had been doomed from the moment it made itself America's enemy. The artillery shell, in this light, became a kind of philosophical statement. Each shell represented choices. Choices about how to organize an economy, how to structure a society, how to relate government and industry, how to mobilize resources, how to value human life. German shells had to be rationed because Germany's economy was relatively small and geographically constrained and under constant attack and organized around conquest rather than production. American shells could be expended freely because America's economy was vast and secure and organized around production scalability and continuous improvement. These were not morally neutral facts. The political and economic system that could produce artillery shells in prodigious quantities was the same system that, however imperfectly, extended voting rights and property rights and legal protections to ordinary citizens. The military that expended steel rather than flesh was the military of a society that valued individual life, that would face political consequences if casualties became too high, that had to justify its actions to an electorate. The abundance that seemed almost wasteful to German eyes reflected an economy where civilian living standards were rising even during the war, where the wealth was broadly distributed enough to sustain mass consumption, where prosperity was assumed rather than sacrificed. This is not to suggest that American democracy in 1945 was perfect or just. It was not. Black soldiers fought in segregated units, and returned to a country that denied them basic rights. Japanese Americans had been interned in camps. Women who had worked in factories during the war would be pushed out of those jobs when the men came home. The wealth was more unevenly distributed than propaganda suggested. The suburbs and highways and mass consumption of the post-war years would have their own costs and contradictions. But in the specific context of January 1945, in that frozen monastery, in the Ardennes, the contrast was nevertheless real. The system that could afford to expend 3,000 artillery shells in 10 minutes was also the system where soldiers knew they would be evacuated if wounded, fed 3 meals a day, paid regularly, and sent home when the war ended. The system that had to ration ammunition was also the system that had sent millions to die on the Eastern Front, that fed its soldiers on dwindling rations, that shot deserters and hanged defeatists, that would end with its cities in rubble and its country divided. After the war, when the full scale of Nazi atrocities became public knowledge, the moral distinctions would become overwhelming, and the question of material superiority would seem almost beside the point. But in the moment, for the soldiers who experienced it, the material reality was what they could actually perceive. The abstract evil of an ideology was hard to see from inside it. The concrete experience of being outgunned, outsupplied, overwhelmed by sheer abundance, that was immediate and visceral and undeniable. The toast that Koch and his officers had drunk to victory by dawn had been an expression of hope rather than expectation. Professional soldiers understand luck and contingency. They know that confident plans collapse on contact with reality. They know that battlefields are chaotic and outcomes uncertain. But they also need to believe that effort matters, that skill makes a difference, that there is some relationship between what they do and whether they win or lose. What the American material advantage did was sever that relationship. It suggested that individual effort and skill and courage, while still meaningful on a human level, were strategically irrelevant compared to industrial capacity and logistics. This was the deeper meaning of that moment when the first American shell lit up the horizon. It was not just the beginning of a bombardment, it was the moment when a particular kind of illusion became impossible to sustain. The illusion that willpower could overcome material reality, that ideological fervor could substitute for industrial capacity, that a militarized society organized for conquest could defeat a democratic society organized for production. The shell was a messenger, carrying not just explosive force, but information. You have already lost. You lost before this battle began. You lost when you chose this war. By the time the sun rose fully on January 18, 1945, the German positions around the monastery had been reduced to rubble. The counterattack that Koch and his officers had been planning would never happen. The defensive line they were supposed to hold had ceased to exist. The soldiers who had been under their command were dead or captured or scattered into the forest. The maps they had studied were obsolete. The toast they had drunk was 8 hours old and belonged already to history. The monastery itself survived. Stone walls that had stood for 300 years proved thicker than high-explosive shells could penetrate, at least with near misses. After the war, it would be partially restored, the shell damage repaired, the bullet scars patched over. Tourists would visit and take pictures and read plaques about the battle. The village nearby would rebuild. The forest would grow back. Life would continue in that gradual way it does after wars end, absorbing the damage, incorporating the memory, moving forward. Koch would survive too. He would spend 2 years in American captivity, teaching mathematics and learning English and slowly comprehending the full scope of what Nazi Germany had done and what it had lost and what he had been part of. He would return to Germany in 1947, find his family alive, though scattered, work as a surveyor because former Wehrmacht officers were not in demand. He would die in 1968, An old man by then, taking with him memories of that last toast, that last moment of illusion before the shells arrived. In his final years, he sometimes spoke about the war with his grandchildren. He would tell them about the monastery, about the sound of the bombardment, about the moment he knew it was over. He would tell them, "We thought we were fighting soldiers, but we were fighting factories." This was the truth that artillery shell carried across the frozen Belgian sky in the pre-dawn darkness of January 18, 1945. Not a truth about tactics or strategy, or even, really, about war in the narrow sense, but a truth about systems and capacities and the hard mathematics of production. A truth about what kind of society can sustain what kind of military effort. A truth about the limits of willpower when facing material disparity. A truth about how wars are won not in single moments of courage or brilliance, but in the accumulated decisions of millions of people working in factories and farms and offices and logistics depots, making and moving and maintaining the physical stuff of warfare. The German generals toasted victory by dawn because they needed to believe victory was possible. Because the alternative, accepting that they had already lost, that every soldier dying from this point forward was dying for nothing, that the war was simply a long collapse toward inevitable defeat, was psychologically unbearable. Because soldiers need hope to function, and commanders need to project confidence, and military organizations need to maintain the fiction of purpose, even when strategic reality has rendered that purpose meaningless. But the American shell lit up the horizon with a different kind of truth, a harder truth. A truth that could be measured in tons of steel and rates of fire and depth of logistics networks. A truth that said, this is what abundance looks like, translated into military force. This is what happens when an industrial democracy decides to fight. This is the weight of a system that produces more, wastes more, has more to spare than you can comprehend. This is what you are actually fighting, not an army, an economy. And that truth, delivered at 300 meters per second in a 43-kilogram package of steel and explosive, made all the toasts and all the plans and all the courage and all the professional skill irrelevant. It made the question not, can we win, but how long until we lose? It made the monastery indefensible, and the position untenable, and the counterattack impossible, and the war, for all practical purposes, already over, even though millions would die before the formal surrender came 4 months later. In the end, the story of that night is not really about victory or defeat in the tactical sense. The monastery was a minor position in a secondary sector of a battle that was already decided. Koch and his officers were not famous generals whose decisions shaped history. The artillery battalion that fired on them was one of dozens doing the same work across the front. The Shermans that accepted their surrender rolled on to the next objective without pausing. The war would have proceeded along roughly the same timeline whether that specific monastery fell on January 18 or January 19, and at 2023, or not at all. The story matters because it captures something about the nature of the conflict that would otherwise be lost in the grand narratives of strategy and policy. It captures the moment of recognition, the instant when belief collides with reality and shatters, the moment when professional soldiers, trained to think about warfare in certain ways, encountered a mode of warfare that made their training obsolete. The moment when an army organized around the idea of superior will discovered that will was no substitute for overwhelming material force. That moment, that toast in the monastery, followed by the shell lighting up the horizon, is the entire war in miniature. It is December 1941 when Hitler declared war on America, toasting victory against a sleeping giant. It is June 1944 when the invasion fleet arrived at Normandy, larger than anything Germany could have assembled. It is August 1944 when American and Soviet forces met at the Elbe, having crushed Germany between them. It is every moment when Nazi ideology's predictions collided with reality and proved false. It is the whole arc of the conflict compressed into 4 hours. Confidence, bombardment, recognition, surrender, and the shell itself, that simple industrial product, one of millions, costing perhaps $50 to produce, expended in a fraction of a second, carries the weight of all the decisions and systems and choices that made it possible. The steel mills in Pennsylvania that produced the casing, the chemical plants in Delaware that produced the explosive, the workers who made them paid wages high enough to buy houses and cars, the trucks that transported them, the ships that carried them across the Atlantic, the logistics officers who tracked them, the artillery crews who fired them, the whole vast interlocking system of industrial democracy that could produce and deliver and expend violence on a scale that defied everything. The German military tradition understood about how wars worked. This is why the German general's toast to victory by dawn echoes with such tragic irony. They were toasting something that had already been decided, not by their courage or skill or determination, but by economic and industrial realities they could not change. They were soldiers trying to solve a problem that no amount of military competence could solve, because the problem was not military, but systemic. They were professionals working within a framework that the actual war had rendered obsolete. And when the first American shell lit up the horizon, it was not announcing a battle. It was announcing a verdict. The verdict that industrial capacity matters more than military tradition, that logistics determines strategy, that abundance defeats scarcity, that democracies, however inefficient and contradictory, can mobilize resources at scales that authoritarian systems cannot match, that the American way of war, wasteful, material-intensive, casualty-averse, rooted in industrial production rather than warrior culture, was the future, and the Wehrmacht's way of war was the past, and the moment of transition between them was that instant when the shell arrived, and the illusion shattered, and the war, for those 11 officers in that monastery, was suddenly and irreversibly over. The horizon lit up with more than fire that dawn. It lit up with the truth of what kind of war they were really fighting, and who they were really fighting against, and what the outcome had always been going to be once America entered the conflict. The shell was a messenger, and the message was simple. You cannot win a long war against the American industrial economy. Therefore, you cannot win this war. Therefore, every toast to victory is a toast to the past rather than the future. Therefore, the dawn brings not triumph, but surrender. And in that moment, as the barrage continued and the monastery shook, and Koch realized he would be giving the order to surrender before noon, the entire architecture of belief and training and ideology that had sustained him through 2 decades of military service collapsed. Not because he had lost courage, not because he had failed in his duty, but because the fundamental premises had proven false, because the war he thought he was fighting, a war of wills and skills and tactical excellence, was not the war he was actually in, which was a war of production schedules and logistics networks and industrial capacity. Because the shell that lit up the horizon was not just destroying defensive positions, it was destroying the conceptual framework through which he understood warfare itself. That is the real story of that night. Not the tactical details of who held what position, not the strategic implications for the broader offensive, but the human experience of confronting a truth too large to accommodate, that you and everything you believed and trained for and fought for has been made irrelevant by forces operating at a scale you did not understand and cannot counter. That the toast you drank was the last moment you could still pretend otherwise. That the shell was the future arriving ahead of schedule, with a message written in fire and steel. This is over. It was always going to be over. The only question was how long it would take you to realize it. The dawn came, as dawns do, indifferent to human conflict. The bombardment ended. The tanks advanced. The surrender was accepted. The prisoners were processed. The war continued. And somewhere in the mathematics of it all, in the firing tables and logistics manifests and production schedules, the truth remained stark and undeniable. Abundance had defeated scarcity. Industry had defeated ideology, and the American artillery shell, that most mundane of products, had proven mightier than all the toasts and illusions and desperate hopes that German generals could muster in a cold monastery on a winter night in the Ardennes.